Cities are the beating heart of any tabletop role-playing game. They're the center of your fantasy world. They're the backdrop against which your adventures will take place. They're the meeting point for your players. They're where you'll gather information and resources later on. They're the center of what you want to focus on in any game. And so today we're going to be talking about how you can create your own city map. I've had a lot of comments in previous videos in which I've created massive, elaborate, illustrated maps from people who say that they love it, but they don't have the skills to create one themselves. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to take you through the process from making a sketch like this into a full map like this. I take commissions here at the Word Quills, and thankfully Jono, shout out to Jono for allowing me to use this map of Esh'qaban, has said I am a-okay to use the process by which I make that sketch into this map so that you can see it for yourselves and apply it to your own worlds. It's a meticulous process, but you can take it step by step and come out with a map that not only has all of the details that you wanted, but more. Something that you can give to your players to add to the immersion, to flesh out your world, and even give you ideas that you had never thought of in the first place. So as I go through today, I'll talk about some of the basic ideas of making a city. I have done it in previous videos so far. Check out the other videos that I've got in my series. But if you wanted to start making your own city, this is a very good place to begin. So grab your pens and pencils. I'm going to take you through the entire process from the initial inception and the sketch that I was given to the full-fledged map. So it begins today with a description. Jono gives me a rough outline of what he wants from Esh'qaban. A large dock, a lighthouse, a few canals, a large palace on the hillside, and the inspiration from the ancient Egyptians. This is an old map of the setting he's currently in, and he wants it to be an inspiration for him that he can have his players travel back to. But that's not really my business. My business is to take this sketch and make it into something fantastic. So I've gotten this approved by Jono. I think this looks like what everyone would have of their city if they haven't put a lot of effort into what their map looks like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the bare bones of it and I'm going to sketch it out. The important points to notice here are the dock in the center, the lighthouse, the canals that connect the dock to the sea, and the palace on the hillside. I'm going to enclose the entire city in a wall, and I'm going to have a small offshore island as well. All of these things have been requested, and they're the bones of what we want. And then I'm going to go through and label it, because I want to make sure as I go through that I've got everything placed correctly and named correctly. And later on when I go through and ink things, I want to make sure that I'm not covering the labels with the inking process. So as I go through here and I talk about this, let's talk about what you want to put into your city maps, what you want to expect to see in something that looks fantastic versus something that might not be everything that you want it to be. And it all comes down really to the details that you put into your map. Every sketch has everything that you need as a DM in order to improvise. And those are the bare bones. You want the basic structure of it, you want the large landmarks and monuments, you want an idea of where the rivers and the bridges and the roads are, but you don't need much more detail than that. So when you're making a big map like this is on A2 as opposed to the sketch, which is on A5. We need a lot more details to make it look like it's a fully fleshed out world. So let's talk about the difference between sparse cities and dense cities. So if you're making a sparse city, you don't need much. We're going to talk about mainly the landmarks, the conveniences, and the dwellings. Those are really the three main categories of what you've got on your map. The landmarks are the big things like the palaces, the lighthouse, the dock in this case. Those are the points that your adventurers will want to go to when they're investigating their quests or they're exploring the city. They're the points that are memorable when you describe the city. Then, of course, you come to the conveniences, the places that everyone needs to go. When your players rock into the city, they'll say something like, I need a health potion, I need more armor, I need to try to steal something from a bookshop. Those will also be on the map, mainly for role-playing and supply purposes. So you have inns there as well. And then lastly is the dwellings, which you use to really flesh out the rest of it. Just the blocks and the alleyways to give the city the feeling that it is inhabited. But you don't put too much detail into that. You don't really need to. And that's a sparse city. That's great, it looks fine on the map, but it doesn't have the details that you need to extrapolate all of the quests that you're going to do if you have a fully city-based campaign. So when I'm making a dense city, which is going to be what this map is, we want to talk about more categories than just those. We want major landmarks, we want functional buildings, we want commercial and industrial areas, and we want dwellings. Right? Dwellings are always the last thing you use to flesh out any city map. So the major landmarks are the same things that you have on the original sketch. They're the palaces, they're the barracks, they're the towers, they're the monuments, they're the important parts. The functional areas are where you'll have quests. They're the watch houses, the courts, the prisons, things like that, or sewer systems perhaps. Commercial and industrial areas are going to be more detailed now. With a larger map, you don't just worry about what your players will need, but also about what the city needs. Large bazaars and markets for the richer citizens, smaller corner stores for the poorer citizens, specialist artisanal boutiques for specific things, industrial areas that manufacture all of the various bits and pieces that a city needs, not just armor and tools, but also things like bricks and tiles, things that you need to build the rest of the city. And then, of course, after that, you have the dwellings. And those categories, the ones for the sparse and dense areas, are great, but there's also a lot to consider about the proportions of those landmarks. In sparse cities, something that's less populated with detail, less realistic, more sketch-like, you've got a proportion of 5 landmarks to every 15 conveniences to every 30 dwellings, which is honestly a lot of landmarks to not very many people. And in this case, I'm not going to say dwellings as individual houses, I'm going to say them as, city blocks, because that's just easier. In the dense areas, you've got even more people per landmark, which is more like how it is in reality. 5 major landmarks in a city with 12 functional areas, 25 commercial buildings, 10 industrial buildings to every 100 dwellings. And that makes a dense city, something that feels like it can be explored. You have a lot of alleyways. You have the opportunity to create things that aren't necessarily on the map because there are so many people living there. You can flesh it out with whatever you like. And so once we've got that idea of what we want to fill our city with, I'm going to go through now, I'm going to be labeling it. As always, as I've said in so many other videos, label first, because you don't want the labels to be crowded. You want them to be easy to read. So I'm going to go through and label it in a red pen now so that it's easier to read later on. And I'm going to use the idea of what I was talking about before in the distribution, the proportions of landmarks on the map to flesh out the different areas. So I've divided the city into suburbs in my original layout. So when I do the original layout, I do the suburbs, I do the major boundaries like the walls and the rivers, the canals here, the major arteries like the roads of the city that define its shape and its function, and of course the locations of the 5 most significant monuments, like the Hewitt Anket here, which is the dock, which is based on the famous dock of Carthage, the lighthouse on the coast, based on the lighthouse of Alexandria. We've got a palace on the corner, which is something that I'll call back to the old pharaohs of Egypt. All ancient monuments, they're all very iconic, very recognizable. And then once I've done those, I go into the features themselves. Once I've established the locations of the major features of the city, I can begin to dot in those which are less iconic, but more functional. Things like where the bazaars are, where the jail is, where the courthouses are, the baths, the architects' halls, things that were given to me on the sketch, but are less important than those major boundaries. And then, of course, I go into the districts and I flesh those out with more concepts, with more role-playing information. Which areas of the city are poorer, which are richer, which areas of the city are residential versus industrial. How do you delineate between those based entirely on the surroundings? For instance, canals are, generally speaking, historically, quite smelly. So you'll attract industrial or poorer residential areas around those, and the richer people will live away from the water, somewhere that smells nicer, somewhere with a lot of breezes, probably high up. So in this case, we'll say that's to the southwest of the city. And then, with those 3 steps, you've fleshed out your initial sketch into something that has a lot of detail. We're not finished yet, though. So I've sketched out the main points now. I'm going to go through and I'm going to just illustrate where the water is so that too is recognizable at a glance. So as always, You go through and label first, then you go and do the natural boundaries, because everything else in the city is going to be built around those two things. Natural boundaries are the major physical point. If you do a building first and then a coastline later, it's going to look a little bit messy. So always do coastlines, canals, bridges, mountains, hills, cliffs, things like that. Always do them first, then do the buildings after that. So while I'm doing that, why don't we talk about the major points of interest, which I'm going to go through now. They were described to me in the sketch, but without a lot of detail. So I'm going to talk about how I took those concepts and fleshed them out and made more of them along. So at this point, I'm going to start with doing the wall outside and then the major buildings inside. The residential areas I'm going to divide into blocks, but the significant points are going to be the buildings themselves. And you can tell the difference because the blocks are more chaotic and random and cluttered, whereas the distinct buildings have a shape to them. You can see the function of them. They have wings and large halls, but they are one distinct structure. So when we're making those buildings, you've got to think about the concepts that are behind the building of them. Are they political, social, cultural, or practical? And everything in the city can be divided into one of those 4 categories. All of the political buildings, that encompasses everything from the palace to the court system to the jails to the propaganda houses, depending on what your city is doing. The cultural icons are things like universities and libraries, but also you have gardens and cemeteries. Those are all cultural. Social areas are things like marketplaces and bazaars, but it also encompasses, religion, different places of worship, and especially things like taverns and inns and brothels, places where people meet and gather and discuss and talk. And then you have the practical aspects, which I've put last on this list, but honestly are generally amongst the most important and well-maintained in a city. Practical things are like floodgates or bridges or dams. They're things that help the city protect itself against the forces of nature. The walls, the gates, they're natural barriers against what's outside the city. Floodgates, tide pools help with the flow of water. The canals here do the same thing. Aqueducts are another great option. I haven't got any in this city, but any city that doesn't have sewers or access to fresh water from wells should consider having an aqueduct system, even if it's in disrepair. So now I've labeled and I've done out the major natural barriers. I'm going to go through into the blocks. So I sketch out in pencil precisely where I want those major icons so I can keep an eye on them later. And now I'm going through with a fine liner pen, and I'm doing the individual blocks. Now you'll notice as I go through that I change how close together the blocks are and how large the blocks are according to how rich or poor an area is. So a very poor area has very small blocks that are very crowded and cluttered and close together because no one really cares about, following, OH&S in a building when you're too poor to afford bricks. You have to steal them. Commercial areas, industrial areas have to be much more careful about how close or far away they are, how large their buildings are, because there's a lot more risk involved in having, say, an armory with a constantly burning fire in the furnace than there is in, just a residential house. And as I go through and I do these blocks, I'm going to add in a lot of detail using them. So you can see that I've added in the towers and the walls, I've decided the sizes of the blocks, I've inferred what the blocks are based on the shapes of them. So residential houses and residential blocks are generally more chaotic, but generally squarer. They have alleyways between them. And commercial areas or commercial buildings want to take advantage of having a lot of shop front, a lot of windows, a lot of display areas. So those are the ones which are angled at the front. So they are more triangular. I've also added in all of the choke points in the sketches as I go. So I'm implying the roads by drawing the blocks rather than drawing the roads specifically. And generally speaking, I find that when you're making a map, you don't really need to draw the roads themselves. Sketch them, absolutely. Put in a pencil line to remind you where they're going to go. But when you're creating your map, you can imply where the roads are based on the buildings themselves. And then you don't have to draw each individual road with a line. And it looks less cluttered, it's easier to read, you can see where the buildings are immediately. Things like train tracks or tram tracks later on, they need to be delineated and they look better when they are, but roads don't necessarily need that. Especially not on this scale. On something much, much larger, you might need to, But here we've got a population of, let's say, about 20 to 30,000. We don't really need to delineate the roads like that. We can see where the gaps are. But you do need to delineate things like bridges and gates, the choke points that stop people from moving through the city or tell them where they need to move through the city. It might come up later on when you're having a high-speed chase. So you can see that the map's really beginning to come together now. I was given a pencil sketch that had very few details and a few pages worth of lore that gave me a lot more in-depth understanding about what the culture was going to be, including who the gods were, what the society looks like, how they mediate disputes. And that tells me a lot about the culture that I can be making here. It's a hot desert area, so they have public baths. They are ruled by a royal family, so they have a palace. They venerate and respect the gods, so they have not only a lot of different worship areas, but a lot of monuments, and the city is delineated by the gods themselves, by their function in the pantheon, according to what part of the city you're in. They're a cultured city for the time, so we've got areas like massive monuments to the dead or to achievements. We've got a library, we've got an architect's tower, and it all begins to come together to paint this picture. And from that one sketch, I haven't needed to really do a grid, I haven't needed to use any rice, I've just taken the concepts, blown it up a little bit, and by using that sketch blown up as just a net over which I can add in a lot more detail, a lot more chaotic randomness that makes it feel real, street names, monument names, where the bazaars are, where the taverns are. That has allowed me to take this sketch and create something much, much bigger with it. So let's use this city as a case study. This is called Esh'qaban. Thanks again to Jono for allowing me to use it. Because it's a great example of having an ancient city. So I'm going to divide it into its features, its culture and society, and its details, and tell you how that allowed me to flesh out the map in particular. So I was told in the initial sketch that the city had a lighthouse, a circular dock, and a palace, which I'll call the Huat Bethar, based on one of the gods and an Egyptian word. And those tell me, firstly, that the city is, on the coast. The palace will be away from the sea because it'll be on a high rocky point so it can overlook everything. The lighthouse implies that there are rocks near to the city, which means that there must be a gentler area in which to enter the docks and everything else is rough rock. When I was talking to Jono about the culture of it, he mentioned that they were a trading center, that they were very social and were considered to be very learned according to all the cities around them, which allows me to make the Grand Bazaar based on Istanbul's, the baths, which are the sign of having a lot of culture in an ancient city, and it certainly implies that they're very hygienic and very prosperous, and an architect's pillar, a studying center, a kind of university for building monuments like the ones they have here, which not only implies that they're very learned, but that they are the authority for building monuments. And then I added in some details later on. Because it's an ancient city, there's a massive divide between the rich and the poor, which allows me to make a privileged area and a more shambolic area, and I divided the merchants from those as well. They have developed currency, but it's quite early on. They haven't really integrated it into society yet. And of course, everything's based on this ancient Egyptian concept. Pantheon is very, very similar to ancient Egypt's pantheon, so I've used that to decorate the outside. A rule of thumb I always find, which works really, really well with maps, is if you want it to look decorative, don't worry about putting decoration on the map itself. A map needs to be functional in order to be a map. So take all of the excess, take all of the impracticality, take all of the excess, take all of the wishful thinking, the willfulness out of the map and decorate the exterior, the borders, the legends, the compass. In this case, I've done the borders and the compass in this illustrated ancient Egyptian style gold and black, because that calls back to the Egyptian style that Jono wanted, and which looks really good, but it doesn't at all interfere with how the map appears to be a very decorative, very aesthetic look. And you can also tell that this map, unlike some of the previous maps that I've done, I put no notes in the margins, which is a conscious choice on my part because it's not my map. What's to put their notes to tell the players what they know, or perhaps just to improvise things later on. And so we're done. It's come together, it's looking really, really good. So why don't we take a closer look at the map? We can see the details that I've added in. It's a very, very simple process to go from a sketch to a main map. And when you zoom in, when you look very closely at it, you can see that it is very simple. But from a distance, all of those simple, tiny, individual details come together to create a tapestry that's filled to the absolute brim with story and culture and immersion. So that's the process that you need to take when you're making any map of your own worlds. You can take that sketch, which is the broad ideas of what you want to use, and just translate it larger. You use it as a net, a meshwork upon which you build everything else. Pencil out the major details, add in all of the monuments, the commercial industrial areas, decide where you want the residential areas, and then when you go through and ink it, it's very, very simple. Ink the labels first, and then the natural landscape and the boundaries. Then you go through and do the individual buildings, and then last of all, you add in the blocks and the exterior details like the compass and the legend and the borders. And once you've done all that, you'll come out with a map that you are very proud of and which looks absolutely fantastic. So once again, thank you to Jono for allowing me to use this map. If you enjoyed it, let me know in the comments. Unfortunately, this one is not available for download on my Patreon, but you can check out the download that I have stuck down there, which is going to be a little bit of a treat for everyone who already follows me. If you want to support what I do, if you found this very helpful, please let me know in the comments, give it a like, subscribe to my channel, follow along, because for the next few weeks I'll be coming out with week after week of making city maps. If this is relevant to your world and your campaign and your process, then hit that subscribe button, leave a comment for me below, even check out my Patreon.